Do you want the next Dan Campbell? Right now, if you're watching this video, you probably clicked on it because you're a Jets fan, Saints fan, Bears fan, a fan of a team that doesn't have their head coach, and you're wondering, who could that next head coach be, and would that be the right hire? Well, I have looked at all of the names that have been at least requested for an interview, and I put together a list of my top 10 favorite head coach candidates heading towards openings, starting with my honorable mention, Mike McCarthy. He just got fired from a head coaching job, and my thing with McCarthy is this guy is definitely a top 32 head coach. He definitely is. He made that very clear this year, where he performed pretty well considering the circumstances with the Cowboys this year. The Cowboys were without Dak Prescott. CeeDee Lamb missed time. Micah Parsons missed time. They had dealt with a lot of injuries, and they still went 7-10, right? This guy is 49-35 since 2020, all right? In the regular season, that's a pretty good record. The only thing is his ceiling, very limited, right? There's a reason that the Cowboys haven't won many playoff games in recent history. He's a big part of that 1-3 playoff record since 2020. I think that his best fit would be the New York Jets. The way I look at it, the Jets need to establish a culture and get back on track. We thought that they were on the right track, but they actually went flying off the rails, flipped over, and burnt to a crisp in horrific fashion. They need someone that could just get them back on a track. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best track possible. It doesn't necessarily have to be the track to a Super Bowl. Someone just needs to get them back to looking like an NFL team. Okay? Because like I said, right now that train, it's burning, it's completely off the rails, it's flipped over. Someone needs to take that train and put it back on a railroad. Okay? McCarthy is the type of guy that could definitely do that. I think they want someone with the experience like McCarthy. He won't lead them to the promised land, but he will get them back into NFL competition, right? Now we move on to the top 10, starting with an offensive coordinator in Todd Moen, the Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator. This guy, he's very creative, right? Very, very creative, and he knows how to take advantage of his player skill set. And he also worked with some notable coaches, right? Look at his fellow Harbaugh tree members. You got Rex Ryan, Jim Caldwell, Chuck Pagano, and by extension, Bruce Arians. The Harbaugh tree has been relatively successful, right? It definitely has. He also worked under Jack Del Rio in Jacksonville and Dirk Koetter in Tampa, right? Those are two guys that, much like Harbaugh, have had some successful branches, all right? Monken is another guy who's in this Harbaugh tree. There's no reason to think that he really wouldn't be overwhelmingly successful. I think that Monken could be a pretty good coach, but there are definitely some questions, the type of questions that you normally have with an offensive coordinator like this. There's going to be a lot of other coordinators on this list. Spoiler alert right there. He doesn't have head coaching experience. That's no secret, and that could definitely scare some people away, but I think the Cowboys are a team that should definitely be willing to take a little bit of a risk on this guy because you moved on from McCarthy, because you don't want to be stuck in mediocrity. Monken, he'll be a boomer bust guy for you. He definitely will. Because, like I said, he has that great offensive scheme that I was talking about, but his game plan can be a little bit questionable. It definitely can. Maybe if he built a staff of other guys that he could go to and rely on, he wouldn't have that issue. But it definitely is a very big concern. The fact that he was straying away from the run game in some playoff games, like that loss to the Chiefs, it definitely was not a great showing. But like I said, this guy definitely has a high ceiling. I think a team should be willing to take a flyer on him. Now we move over to another offensive coordinator. This is a guy the Cowboys have shown a lot of interest in, Kellen Moore, right? Much like the guy before him, Todd Moen, he's a great offensive mind, and this guy's young, only 36 years old. That is a nice guy to, once again, all these coordinators are kind of gambles. This is a nice guy to take that gamble on, because if you do land on him and he's good, you have him for like a solid 30 years, right? Like, you'll have this guy for a while if you hit on him. So that's definitely a huge plus. He's a talent optimizer, right? If you give Kellen Moore a talented group of guys, he's going to do what he can to optimize them. Monken is very similar in that way, but that's really like what I like about Kellen Moore, his ability to optimize players. But not only does this guy not have head coaching experience, he has very little coaching experience, period. Right? This guy was a player less than a decade ago, all right? Kellen Moore is a very young guy, and what comes with that is you don't have too much experience, right? And then the other major con for him, and this one might not make a lot of sense when you first look at it, never considered invaluable. What exactly does that mean? By that, I mean you look at his history, right? McCarthy wanted to replace him when he was on McCarthy's staff after a couple of years. Now, he did do a pretty damn good job with the Cowboys, but McCarthy opted to get rid of him. And then the Chargers moved on from Staley midseason, and he wasn't promoted to the interim. Right? Now, that could have partially been because of his lack of experience. But if you have an issue with the lack of experience, enough of an issue to say, yeah, I'm questioning hiring him, but he does seem to be that smart. Well, the Chargers didn't feel that way, so why should you? Right? It's definitely worth mentioning. Now, he's done a phenomenal job with Philly, and now that he's worked under a third staff, maybe that makes you say, okay, this guy, even though he has only been coaching since 2018, he's had experience all over the league. Now, I have the best fit for Kellen Moore as the Bears because this guy's a former quarterback. He could help Caleb Williams grow out of some of the rookie mistakes that we've seen him make throughout this year because this guy, Caleb Williams, you can tell he's legit. He's very talented, but it's just about taking him to that next level, making him use that talent the way that an NFL quarterback should be. Kellen Moore, him being a former quarterback, he could do that, and he could help him feel comfortable. Kellen Moore designs these offenses around smart quarterbacks. Caleb Williams is a smart quarterback. He just needs to grow comfortable in a scheme to really take advantage of that. You bring in an offensive head coach like this, he would definitely be able to do that. Robert Saleh, this guy isn't a former coordinator, or at least he's not coming straight from a coordinator job. This guy was the head coach of the Jets last year, as a lot of you may know. Great defensive mind, and that was the same when he was a head coach, right? He did a great job with that defense with the Jets. He was even successful with the 49ers when he was a defensive coordinator there. He was also very liked by the players, especially on the defensive side of the ball. When this guy got fired, there were plenty of players saying, wow, you know, they weren't overly vocal because they worked with the Jets, but there were definitely some guys saying, man, we miss Saleh, and you could tell just how much him being gone affected that locker room and especially affected that defense. But the most important thing as a head coach is that you win football games, and this guy, he was 20-36 as a head coach. That is really unimpressive. Didn't have any playoff berths, nothing like that, and he didn't build a very good staff, especially on the offensive side of the ball. He was not great at building the staff. Whether or not you want to blame him for the Hackett hiring, that's your decision to make. But I think it is very important to mention the LaFleur hiring. That one didn't go well at all. That one was pitiful. He didn't do a great job hiring guys to teach the young players on the offense. That's part of the reason why the offense was so bad for so long. Saleh couldn't build a staff on the offensive side of the ball that well. Will that change? Did we get that much time to really evaluate his staff building ability? That's up to whoever wants to maybe hire him to decide. But personally, I do think that his stint with the Jets showed more than anything this guy struggles to build a staff, and I think that's his number one issue. But I do think if he goes to the Saints, a team that already has an offensive coordinator in place that you want to keep in place, right? If Saleh goes over there, you retain Clint Kubiak, I think that could go very, very well for them. And then he builds the defensive staff. He takes care of that defense. I think the thing about the Saints is that if the defense starts to look really good, they could build their identity around that. So I really like the potential hiring of Robert Saleh. Now, my number 7 is a guy that hasn't gotten a head coaching interview. So why am I talking about him? Well, it's because I think he's more than deserving of at least consideration, right? This guy, I'm telling you, I know he works under Kevin O'Connell, and he's an offensive guy, so how much of it is really his offense? right? He, much like a lot of other people on this list, he doesn't have a head coaching experience, but he absolutely should be considered because he's a McVay disciple. And I know it sounds crazy, but if you even do as much as sitting down for lunch with Sean McVay, it seems like you get interviewed for all these different jobs. Because the reality is, these McVay guys, these Shanahan guys, they just work. Especially when they're on the offensive side of the ball. They just work. And again, I know it wasn't entirely his offense, but it was really impressive. What he did with Darnold this year, how that receiver core has looked incredible. They keep drafting guys and they instantly look great. Wes Phillips, as someone that has a lot to do with that passing game, he deserves a lot of consideration for these jobs. Not to mention, he could always just consult his father, who is a former head coach, in Wade Phillips, right? The fact that he has a resource like that, the fact that he's in this bloodline, shows you he has a little bit more of what it takes to be a head coach. So not only is he connected to McVay, he's also connected to Wade Phillips, right? Having those resources, not only to bring in offensive coordinators, but also former head coaches, right? And talking to them, even if they're retired, talking to them about how to be a better coach. Wes Phillips has the ability to do that. He has a good head on his shoulders. He deserves a lot of consideration. I think Jacksonville would be a good landing spot for him because look at what he did with Darnold, right? Darnold is a very talented quarterback, and Darnold in the structure of the Wes Phillips offense really looked good. Trevor Lawrence, he looks a little bit bad, but we know he has the talent. Wes Phillips could do the same exact thing. Allow him to operate in this structure, and then when he needs to operate outside of structure, we know Trevor Lawrence can do that. He'll be able to build a system around Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence won't be the system. I really like that idea. Wes Phillips is a perfect guy to do it. Then his defensive coordinator, the guy who worked with him, Brian Flores, I have as my number 6. I know it might seem a little bit low, right? Because he was a pretty good head coach in the past with the Dolphins, right? That Dolphins team heavily overperformed expectations. And that defense that he runs, it's the most schematically advanced defense in the NFL right now. It is. So this guy is a great defensive mind. He can overperform or lead your team to overperform as a head coach. But the stuff that Tua said about him recently does really concern me. How is he as a locker room guy? I think that's very important. We talked about Dan Campbell a little bit earlier in this. We're going to talk about him again later on because, as you might imagine, there's going to be some Dan Campbell disciples on this list. The most important thing for a head coach, or at least one of the most important things, is the ability to keep that locker room together and be a leader of men. It doesn't sound like Flores, despite having a pretty good time in Miami as the head coach, it doesn't sound like he was great at that. And stuff like what Tua said is a big reason why I think that. I also thought he didn't do a great job building a staff offensively, just like Robert Saleh. He has a very similar issue, right? He had 4 offensive coordinators in his 3 years with Miami. Chad Osea was a one-and-done OC, and he's now a passing game coordinator and receivers coach for the Cleveland Browns. Chan Gailey was also an offensive coordinator. He was their offensive coordinator the year after Osea, and he is no longer in the NFL. Then in 2021, Brian Flores' last year, they had 2 offensive coordinators, George Godsey and Eric Studsville, neither of which have received an offensive coordinator job since. Flores, as great as he does with the defense, his job with the offense and building a staff on the offensive side of the ball isn't great. However, a team like the Cowboys that has a lot of talent, like CeeDee Lamb, like Dak Prescott, they have some talented young offensive linemen there too. You get a lot more flexibility. You might not make the perfect hiring on the offensive side of the ball, but you still have a good enough offense to let you win games with your defense. I think Flores in Dallas would be a really, really nice fit. Now we move over to the big boys. I look at this top 5. These would be like the guys you want. These are the number one, these are my guys right here. Even if you don't get the number one guy on this list, you should feel really happy if you get anyone in the top 5, right? Does this mean all of the top 5 are going to work out? No. No, it doesn't, because it's very difficult to tell at this moment. You can't tell who's a head coach until they're a head coach. And even then, there's a lot of asterisks all over the place. It's very difficult to evaluate head coaches, right? If you get anyone in this top 5, you should feel happy. But the thing is, a lot of these guys, you don't know what you're getting. Pete Carroll, you know what you're getting. If he's willing to take a job, which it sounds like he is, but I don't think it's quite a guarantee. If Pete Carroll is willing to take a job, this guy better get hired, because he isn't just a head coach in the NFL. He's one of the best. He's one of the best of the 2010s, and he would be one of the best available here in 2025, right? This guy, you want to talk about the ability to lead, right? The ability to keep a locker room together. Pete Carroll is amazing at that. His 137, 89, and 1 career record is a perfect example of that. He made that record not with these, golden boys in the locker room. He had a lot of big personalities, but he knew how to handle it, and you got to give him a lot of credit for that. Now, he is 73 years old, which should scare some teams away. And, he's not a schematic genius. He's not going to call plays on either side of the ball. But if you're a team like the Jets and you're just looking for direction, perfect hiring right here. If the Jets hire Pete Carroll, I would be able to convince myself that they're a somewhat functional organization. I really do, because I know Pete Carroll is a great head coach. And this Jets team, they don't have direction, it feels like. It seems like they're built to win now, but they very clearly can't. So there's a lot of questions. If you bring in some of these other guys we're going to look at later, if you bring in one of these first-year guys, are they going to be rebuilding, or are they going to try and compete right now? With Pete Carroll, because of his age, it almost gives them direction. You know the identity. And because of that, it will be easier for players to buy into the culture. I think it would be a truly great hiring if the Jets could get their hands on a Pete Carroll, despite his history there. Now we move over to my number 4. I know a lot of people thought this might be number 1. I know. I'm not quite as high, but I still think this guy would be a great hiring. This guy, his offensive schemes, his play calling, it's great. It's spectacular. This guy, the plays that he's drawing up, the gap scheme run game that he's drawing up, the rhythm-based passing game that has the ability to be very explosive when they need it to be. He is such a great coordinator who designs a great offense to do what a lot of these top-notch coordinators do, maximize their talent, right? And he also has made several players into studs, right? You look at some of these other guys, maybe a Todd Moen, who we mentioned earlier. Yeah, he's a very good coordinator. He knows how to get the most out of his players. But what about when he has a subpar roster? How does he elevate it? To me, the really nice thing about a Ben Johnson in comparison to a Todd Moen or a Kellen Moore is that with Kellen Moore, you're able to do more with more, right? With Todd Moen, you're able to do more with more. What can you do with a lesser roster? Ben Johnson, we know what he could do with a lesser roster because this Lions offense, we saw it get built up to the point it is now. It wasn't always this superstar team. No, at one point, it was a weaker roster, and Ben Johnson built it up. You got to give him a lot of credit, right? Guys like Amon-Ra. Amon-Ra was not a first-rounder. He wasn't a second-rounder. He was a later pick, right? Jared Goff at one point was seen as a scrub, seen as one of the most overpaid players in football. Now look at him. Jahmyr Gibbs, a lot of questions about him, at least from people like me, right? There were plenty of people who hated the Jahmyr Gibbs pick. Now we look at it very fondly, okay? And it's because of what Ben Johnson does. It's because of his ability to take guys that are a little bit, they're a little bit flawed, and then make them seem great. And you got to give Ben Johnson all the credit in the world for that. His cons, though, he doesn't have head coaching experience, right? That's a very common thing in this list. And I know head coaching experience is valuable, and it makes some of these guys risky when they're not a former head coach. But at the same time, if you want to get Kyle Shanahan, if you want to get one of those top head coaches, if you want to get a Sean McVay, you got to take a gamble on a coordinator. That's the reality. Because these former head coaches, there's a reason they got fired most of the time. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, Andy Reid. But for the most part, if you want to have one of the best coaches, which every team does. That's the secret to not just 1 year success, but maintain success. You got to take a gamble on a coordinator more commonly than not. Ben Johnson is one of those guys that might have the ability to be one of those top-notch guys, but his lack of head coaching experience is very concerning. And I think more than anything, it isn't a question, can this guy lead a locker room? It's been made kind of clear by reports and just the overall vibe from that team. This guy isn't a leader of men. He's likable. Players have been vocal about liking him, but the leaders on that team in that locker room are Aaron Glenn, Dan Campbell. There's not enough room for all of those alphas. They have the two alphas. Ben Johnson doesn't seem to be one of those true attention grabbers, energy builders. I think it's pretty clear now that he's not one of those guys. I think that he would be a great fit on the Raiders, though. I think that because the Raiders have some strong offensive linemen that he can mold to make great, right? I think that they have a great weapon in Brock Bowers. How could he be utilized? How could you get the most out of such a versatile player? I think Jacoby Myers is a very good receiver that might be able to play that Amon-Ra St. Brown role. I think Ben Johnson on the Raiders could be a very nice fit. Then we move over to Joe Brady. This is my number 3. And he's very similar to Ben Johnson. Very similar. Great offensive mind, and just like him, he developed several great players into studs. Some of the top players in the league right now, Joe Brady's responsible for. Joe Burrow? Joe Brady did that, right? With LSU, he had that glow up under Joe Brady, in Joe Brady's passing game, okay? Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, you think that they're very good receivers? Hey, you know who the receiver coach was in 2020 for LSU? It was Joe Brady, right? He was the passing game coordinator and the wide receivers coach. He's responsible for one of the best wide receiver rooms in college football history, right? Joe Brady did that right there. Very, very impressive. And he's been a great coordinator for the Bills. Now, that's great, but what about his time with the Panthers? That is a big red flag for me, because I think even though he can clearly develop players, there's a little bit of a conversation about his ability to do more with less, at least in a single season. Maybe over time he's able to really maximize those guys, but doing more with less, he seems a little bit less capable than a Ben Johnson in that way, because his tenure with the Panthers didn't go well, right? His tenure did not go well with the Panthers, and it's not just that Joe Brady lacks head coaching experience. He lacks overall NFL experience. He only has 7 years in the NFL, and 2 of those years were with the Panthers, and very underwhelming. The Panthers had the 24th ranked offense in points per game, and then the 29th the year after. That being said, though, it was more than just, oh yeah, the Panthers are bad, Joe Brady couldn't do well with them, I guess he's kind of a Joe Burrow merchant, I guess he's kind of a Josh Allen merchant. He could have built that offense around Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey played a total of 10 games in both of those 2 years combined. So, yeah, I kind of get it. I give him a little bit of a pass on that, but it definitely raises some suspicion. I have his best fit as the Bears because Joe Brady developed Joe Burrow, who was a very talented quarterback, into an amazing quarterback altogether. Right? Caleb Williams is also a very talented quarterback. Can you get him to do more of that Joe Burrow type of, game management stuff? If you could drill that in, Caleb Williams all of a sudden becomes one of the game's tippity top tier quarterbacks. And I also hope he gives him more of the Josh Allen treatment in terms of how he handles the offense, right? I want to see him build this offense and make it so they don't have to rely on Caleb. We saw they relied on Caleb maybe a little bit too much this year. You want to build a structure where they don't have to rely on Caleb, so this way when Caleb does make the insane play, it's more of a surprise, right? You want to only be relying on Caleb to make some magic happen on those 3rd and longs, right? On those crucial moments, on those 2-minute drills. That's when you want to be relying on Caleb. That is what the Bills are doing currently with Josh Allen because of the structure that Joe Brady has installed. This guy, I feel really good about him. I mentioned how much I think it's important that Wes Phillips was a former coordinator or former offensive coach under McVay, and now he's a coordinator under a McVay disciple in Kevin O'Connell. Liam Coen also worked under Sean McVay. He was an offensive coordinator under Sean McVay for a year, and they got hired to Tampa Bay. He had his own offense without McVay, and it was great. It was great. His offensive scheme elevated a roster that was pretty mediocre. That offense with Baker Mayfield, the offensive line, the running backs, the wide receiver core, it seemed like it should have been, a middle-of-the-pack offense. But because of what Liam Coen did with the scheme and how he designed it, the quick passing game, all of that stuff, how he designed the run game especially, he outperformed anyone's and everyone's expectations on the offensive side of the ball. That was a great job by Liam Coen right there. And it was his only year without McVay, but that's a big concern too. He only had 1 year without McVay. Can he continue to produce high-caliber offense without McVay? That is a big question to be seen. Of course, his connection to McVay is a very nice strength. He has connections to all of those strong McVay former passing game coordinators, wide receiver coaches, tight end coaches, offensive line coaches, all those guys. And his lack of NFL experience, that is a big concern, just like Joe Brady. The reason that I'm going with the Jaguars here for Liam Coen is because I think Liam Coen has an innate ability to develop a structured offense. I want to see what Trevor Lawrence looks like when the offense has legitimate structure, okay? And because Coen is a McVay guy, I can only imagine what a McVay guy could do with a Trevor Lawrence. All right, I feel like that would be crazy to see. And Liam Coen, he could build a run game. We saw it in Tampa. He could build a damn good run game. If Trevor Lawrence has a legitimate run game and the offense has legitimate structure, and then he kind of becomes this complementary piece despite being a very talented quarterback, I really, really like how the Jaguars' future looks. I know it has been very common. I've mentioned a lot of guys who lack experience, but that is, again, because personally I'm a risk taker when it comes to these head coaches. I always have been. I think when you're hiring a head coach, a large portion of the time, maybe not all the time, but a large portion of the time, you should swing for the fences, right? You don't want just mediocrity. You don't want to rehash a head coach. Now, there's some situations where you want to go against that, but for the most part, you want to stick to coordinators that have the ability to be a head coach because that's how you get some of those top dogs. And I think Aaron Glenn has the ability to be one of those top dogs. Now, Aaron Glenn, the thing that makes him very unique, despite the fact that he doesn't have much head coaching experience, we know this guy can be a leader of men. We know it. We know it for a fact. He's a former player, and we know what he's been doing for that defense. You could see it on the field, the fire that defensive unit plays with, and he's a big reason why. We've heard nothing but raving reports about who he is as a culture guy, but he's also a great defensive mind on top of that, right? It's very rare that you find someone that seems to specialize in both, right? And Aaron Glenn seems to be one of those guys that can be a great leader in the locker room, but then also be a great X's and O's guy. That being said, I think he's a little bit too confident in the scheme that he draws up because there are times where he gets a little bit stubborn, right? Him and his man blitz heavy type defense, his aggressive defense, I think there are times where he can overcommit to it when the personnel is too banged up to execute that, when the personnel just isn't quite good enough to execute that. Now, when he has the pieces, it looks great, but when he doesn't have the pieces, that type of scheme can struggle, but he doesn't make the proper adjustment. And of course, he lacks the head coaching experience. But when you have the type of personality, the leader of men type of build that he does, it makes you feel very good. And it makes you think he'll be able to build a good enough defense to give this Saints team identity. Notice the two defensive guys I have put on this list. I think the Saints would be the best fit. Right, two of the defensive guys that I put on this list, I think the Saints would be the best fit. And then Brian Flores, I also think would be a great fit for the Saints. I just think the Cowboys would be a better fit for him. The Saints are this team that I think really just wants to have a unit to define them. Aaron Glenn, what he could do to this defense can allow that to define them. And him being the personality he is, I think they could get fired up. And for the first time in a while, it'll seem like the Saints are really fighting to win football games. I think he could be a complete culture changer there. Aaron Glenn is my number one. Thank you all again for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe for more content. Thank you again, and I'll see you all in the next video.